Hello, everyone, and welcome to the college lecture series of the Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning here at the University of Michigan. I'm Jonathan Massey. I'm Dean and Professor here, and I'm glad to bring you what is a big annual event here at the college, the Raoul Wallenberg Lecture, given this evening, as you just saw, by Michael Kimmelman. Since fall 2011, Kimmelman has been the architecture critic of the New York Times. Previously, he served as the paper's longtime chief art critic, then as a reporter covering Europe and the Middle East from Berlin. His Abroad column covered topics such as life under Hamas in Gaza, the crackdown on culture in Putin's Russia, negritude in France, and bullfighting in Spain. As a best-selling author, Kimmelman has twice been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and he's won many awards, including the Brendan Gill Prize for insightful candor and continuous scrutiny of New York's architectural environment. His work addresses urban affairs, public space, housing for the poor, infrastructure, social equality, the environment, as well as design. He has a very broad construction of what it means to be an architecture critic and has really shaped public conversations, not only in architecture, but in urban planning and many other fields. And this approach to architecture as a humane social art aligns with the purpose of this evening's event. So I'm going to say a little bit about Raoul Wallenberg. Wallenberg is among the University of Michigan's most notable alumni, a native of Sweden who completed his degree in architecture here at the precursor of Taubman College. He's remembered for saving tens of thousands of Jews in Nazi-occupied Hungary in the later stages of World War II. In January 1945, Soviet authorities detained Wallenberg in Budapest, and he has since been presumed dead. The Raoul Wallenberg Lecture was started in 1971 by Saul King, a former classmate of Wallenberg's at the University of Michigan. An endowment established 5 years later supports this annual lecture, again on the theme of architecture as a humane social art. And past speakers have included, from a very long list, Rainer Banham, J. Max Bond Jr., Charles Correa, Denise Scott Brown, David Adjaye, Michael Murphy, and most recently I.L. Weitzman, among many other leaders of our field. So a little bit about what we're going to do this evening. We're going to hear a bit from Michael in a little bit of a dialogue with me. We decided, for the sake of the audience in this age of online everything, that we would break up the traditional lecture format and instead have a little bit more of a dialogue. And then I'm going to bring in two of our students, editors or co-editors of two of our student publications, Dimensions on the architecture side and Agora on the urban planning side. And so in the latter part of this evening's event, those two editors will take over and they'll continue the conversation with Michael. And then I will try to work in some audience comments and questions toward the end of the event. So thank you for joining us. I'm going to now start the conversation a bit. So Michael, welcome to Taubman College through this StreamYard YouTube platform.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's a pleasure and really an honor to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me.
We're glad to have you. So one strand in your work is a recurring focus on public spaces as sites of political action and civic health, both medical and biological health, but also the health of our society and its civil sphere. You've written about places like Tahrir Square or Taksim Square, Tiananmen Square, Zuccotti Park, places that have really become focal points for the intersection of political action. And you've helped us understand how claiming city spaces ends up shaping social movements and advancing political claims. This year in the US, public protest and political rallies relating to the Black Lives Matter movement and the elections, for instance, have taken on a special intensity in light of the pandemic and in light of efforts to suppress political speech. What are your thoughts about continuities and changes in the role of public space these days in political mobilization?
You know, it's a super interesting question, of course, because I think in many ways, the sort of importance of public space is not really always consciously understood by people. And we share so much when, especially those of us who live in cities, we share the streets and sidewalks, we share public transportation, we share parks and plazas, as well as stores and libraries and public institutions, all of which in a way constitute the network of public space that is the area where I think we decide who we are as a society collectively. And as I say, I think most of us, it's not that we take those spaces for granted necessarily, but we don't necessarily think about how they are designed and what their design represents about us. So it is interesting that it is often crises or conflicts that alert us to the crucial ways in which public space defines us and shapes who we, not just who we are, but who we want to be. So, when I started in this job in 2011, and 2012, I was the end of 2011. It coincided with an interesting moment, which was that there were protests. The Occupy movement had just started at that point, around then. And I started to go down to Wall Street, where protesters were gathered in a place called Zuccotti Park. And it wasn't clear necessarily what the intentions of the protests were. They were coming out of the economic collapse of 2009, and the sense of inequity which had produced that financial collapse, the mortgage crisis and so many bankruptcies, and then the bailout of big banks. And it was very interesting to actually be at Zuccotti Park, because what you saw was a space that had been kind of, it was a place where what people worked on or near Wall Street went to have lunch, basically. And it had an interesting history. I don't want to take up too much of our time here, but I think it's relevant to this discussion in a way. It was a space that developers of a very tall building on that, adjacent to that site, had promised to give. Essentially, it was a privately owned public space. They created this little park in exchange for building a taller building. So it was a mechanism to provide private financial interests with the right to occupy more, essentially, of the city in return for some handout to the public, which in this case was a park, rather nicely designed, but quite simple, not very big, a city block, but a small city block. And the reason the protesters went there was because it happened to be a place where the city had not made rules about curfews, which existed in public parks. So by a strange, weird twist of fate, this site became a place, because there were no existing laws prohibiting it, where protesters, and a few hundred of them, could essentially sleep and camp and create something. And I'll just say a couple other things about that. What did they do? They created what I came to perceive as a sort of model city, a better society, essentially. There was a library, there was a place people could get food, there was a medical unit, there was a place for people to sleep and keep. It was a little polis, or a little idea of a city, of a better city, and also a place where people could give speeches and share materials and information. And the other interesting thing, so I think that was interesting, the very fact that they used public space to demonstrate essentially what a better society might look like. And then I think the effect of Occupy was essentially to question who controlled public space. What did it mean to occupy what was supposedly public open space? And this became part of the conversation in the city, people were not people. Some people were upset about it. Some people were pleased. I think, we saw in a case like that, as you mentioned, other places where the same thing happened, in Cairo, in Istanbul, in Taksim Square, where very similar kinds of sequence had taken place. Essentially, people occupied the space and designed a kind of little community. I think what was quite interesting was to see that the occupation of physical space by what was really just a few hundred people in the case of Zuccotti, and not much more in Tahrir, fewer actually in Taksim, was able to create an impact that reached far beyond New York and actually became known around the world. And what that tells you, I think, which is very important, is that, for all of the power of what we're doing right now, which is having a conversation online, which can, stream on YouTube and whatever, and for all of the power of online communications and social media, the power of public space, of physical space, is so great that simply the presence of a few hundred people in a public space can shape the national conversation around very key issues like equity and inequity, racial justice, and so on, which is, I'm sure, where we're going to move in a moment. That was not surprising to me, but I think it was a very important point to make. And the last thing I'll say about this is, of course, it is architects, urban planners, designers who shape public space in conjunction with communities, government officials, and so on. And so the conversation effectively about what that public space is like, who should have access to it, what it should supply, this is fundamentally a conversation about the nature of the society we want to have. And therefore, it is the job of architects, designers, planners to think about this, not just as a matter of materials and square footage. And it is, I think, also the job of somebody like me who writes about this to make that connection, to make clear that this field extends beyond whether that Zuccotti Park is a nice looking park to how it functions and what it means in our society.
I did a project documenting the camp in Zuccotti Park at the time, and I was really struck by what I came to think of as the micro-urbanism of that, in the end, very tiny space, in which the location of a retaining wall relative to the prevailing winds or to the sun exposure, the layout of trees and of tables for office workers to eat lunch, as you noted, the layout of those tables prompted people to appropriate the physical landscape of the city in distinctive ways that ended up feeding into the shape of the organization. I was also really struck by the role of crowd maps and online forums and the kind of interplay, the connection to camps elsewhere in the country and in the world, learning from people who had camped out in Spanish cities just a few months before. And I wonder if this summer you've observed, so one of the conversations we're having here at the University of Michigan is one of the ways to think about it is rebuilding the public sphere or the public square. How have platforms like Twitter and how has that interplay, do you think, between the distinctively powerful act of claiming a physical space that you were just talking about? Do you see that operating differently in an age when the public conversation is often set through platforms like Twitter that are incredibly distributed and incredibly quick?
Yeah, I mean, look, the key thing about what's happened in this past year, I think, is that you have had a very important and overdue conversation about racial justice in this country, which has been which is played out largely through the policing, often violent policing of public space. And that conversation would not be happening in the same way if it were not possible, as it is now, to circulate quickly and widely evidence of crimes and other violence that has happened in those spaces. So the interplay of these events that have rightly caused people to take to the streets, and then the distribution of that and the conversation around it through social media to amplify and rally people around the issue of justice is crucial. But I get back to the key issue, which is that it is nonetheless the central question of who we are that the issue of policing and occupation of these spaces, is played out in those spaces. So it's not a hypothetical question. Do people feel unsafe in those spaces? Do they feel that, what does it mean to be a public? Who is the public? And how is that space controlled, and by whom? So at the heart of a lot of this question is, if there is really equality in this country, then people should be treated equally in these spaces. Of course, it's true in people's homes as well. And, Breonna Taylor, and there are a million other examples of injustice taking place in spaces that are not technically public space. But I think, not coincidentally, so much of what has unfolded in recent years and been amplified through social media has happened, in the streets, or in areas which, in parks, in areas that are gated, where the space is ambiguous, whether it's public or not, who's allowed to walk through these spaces. It comes down again to this, I think, fundamental issues about democracy and equal access. Then, I'm sorry, I know I'm droning on, but of course, I'm in New York City, and one of the other, really fundamental questions that has arisen this year is about, is around COVID, is about public health. And, when New York was under lockdown, everyone needed to have some place to go eventually, and what was safe. So, the really going outside was crucial to mental as well as physical health and safety. But there are, I now know, 15 million parking spaces in New York City. That is spaces on the street dedicated to private cars. And, there is enormous inequity in the distribution of public parks. And so much, about a quarter of the city is given over to cars in total. So what happened was there was a push to turn over essentially public space, streets, sidewalks, and so forth, plazas, to I meant parking areas to pedestrians and to local businesses. And what has happened, is really astonishing. Not just in New York City, you have 10,000 restaurants, for instance, which have gotten permits to operate outdoors, and 40 miles of streets have been turned over to pedestrians. 10,000 of those parking spaces have been given up as well. It's phenomenal.
If we take if we consider the repurposing and renewed thinking around the infrastructure of parking spaces as a positive discovery and transformation in the last half year, I'm wondering what are the other? I'm thinking there are some other flashpoints in the conversation. For instance, there have been big debates about the housing of homeless folks in Upper West Side hotels in New York that has pointed to the inadequate infrastructure for housing as a basic human need and right. There have been arguments about Rikers Island, the jail, that predate the pandemic, but have really been intensified and focalized by the epidemiological problems at Rikers. What are some of the other key infrastructure? Yeah, what are some of the other ways that this last half year is leading you to see infrastructure in new ways, positive and negative?
Well, first of all, look, to basically take away like 2 parking spaces was a bloodbath politically in the city. Now 10,000, basically thousands have just been taken immediately. So what it tells you is it is possible to bring about change at scale. That's one of the main lessons. And then the implications of that change are multiple. The benefits are many. They not only have to do with mental health, but they have to do with the environment and therefore with climate change and, but hand in hand with that is the assumption that people in a city like New York, but this is true in other cities, can manage without cars to get to their jobs or get around the city, and therefore, public transit is at the very heart of issues of equity and economic justice in the city. And COVID has made many people fearful about getting on the subway, and even though there is no evidence that it is, especially dangerous, I've ridden the subway many times. I mean, I'll admit, it can be nervous making, but it's also seems to be, knock on wood, safe. No less safe than going to a restaurant or gathering in the park. So this crisis has pointed out to us, I think, the ways in which all of these aspects of the city, housing, homelessness, public transit, public space, parks, all these things are interconnected, and we can't continue to think about the cities we create, the communities we create, without understanding the relationship among these different things, each of which is extremely, obviously, complicated. You mentioned homelessness and hotels on the Upper West Side. The most famous one is virtually outside my window here, and it raises a very important point. It was a place called the Hotel Lucerne. It's a very nice hotel, actually, with a fancy schmancy Mediterranean restaurant in it called Nice Matin at the corner. The building, the entrance to the hotel is just next to it. And this neighborhood actually is a good example of the way in which I think people don't notice as I was saying, people don't always notice what's around them. Actually, there are a number of public housing projects which have been around forever. Just 1 block away from me, there's on a pretty fancy street right here, there is a facility for single mothers. And around the corner in the direction I was just pointing in, there's a formerly homeless facility for seniors. So there are a number of facilities in this area, and they're perfectly integrated in the neighborhood. This is a very affluent part of New York, but it functions. It's one of the safest neighborhoods. I'm very lucky to live here. I actually couldn't afford to live here now, but I moved here a long time ago. So when these shelters were created, these hotels were converted for reasons of COVID, of course. It was interesting to see there was a backlash. Now, I have to say, there was a backlash among a few very vocal people, but a large number of people in this community were outraged by the the complaints about the homeless and the lies, straight up lies about what those people had brought to the neighborhood. There were no incidents of any kind whatsoever. And in the age of, Trump, we just had people lying and spreading lies on social media. The reason I mentioned that restaurant, Nice Matin, was because the owner of that restaurant, it was a fancy restaurant, had made a public statement and said, nothing has happened in this restaurant. We're functioning. We've had no incidents whatsoever. And we welcome and regard it as a duty and an important part of the city that these people be allowed to stay in the hotel. I went into the restaurant and saw the maitre d', and I said, I wanted to say something to if you could pass along a message to the owner. And the maitre d' I saw stiffen because I sensed that she anticipated I was going to say this. I said, I just wanted to pass along a message that I wanted to thank your owner for saying the right thing publicly. And, it'll certainly make me, and I'm sure others, want to support this restaurant. So what is this speech about? It's basically a way of saying that I think we've come to a time when we as a society are so split and so we are so willing to lie, and we're split racially, we're split economically, we're obviously split politically, we're split between urban and rural. And one of the problems facing, I think, the next administration and us as cities and society in the coming years is to try to figure out how to have a rational conversation again around these crucial issues. So in many cities, and certainly here in New York, you have this very unfortunate and troubling alliance now, which you see in this homeless conflict between traditional NIMBYs, who are generally affluent, well-to-do, and often tenant organizations who represent vulnerable residents who are fearful that any change to a neighborhood will bring about displacement. And this alliance between traditionally opposed people around the idea that any change needs to be opposed, including in the case of, the Lucerne Hotel and the homeless, even providing people with shelter, temporary shelter. This, I think, has to be opposed and really needs people on the left especially to come out essentially against this idea that all change, all development is bad because we need more housing. We need more affordable housing, especially in places for the homeless and as well as middle-class families. And we don't just need that in New York.
Thank you. So shifting gears a little bit and moving toward the moment when we bring in our two student editors, one of your responses to the constraints of the pandemic was to take readers of the New York Times on virtual walks through the city to highlight one of the ways of acting in an urban context that was still available to people. And you've got something in the works at the Times called Headway that I think is similarly a kind of pivot from the primacy of the written word and the single voice in the way we report on the built environment. Could you tell us a little bit about what direction you're moving in?
Sure. I mean, like everyone else, I had to figure out how to do my job when I was locked down at home. And I'll be honest, I had two feelings. One was I didn't want to get into the prognosticating business. Everyone was predicting what was about to happen, and what was happening was changing every day. So, there were all these, the city was dead. Everyone was going to leave New York. No one would be there again. It was just like after 9/11 when everyone said, no one's going to live in New York. No one will ever live in a tall building again. And of course, what followed was the greatest boom in skyscraper construction in the history of the city, the world, really. So I wanted to get out of that sort of prognosticating stuff, but I also wanted to focus on something that was positive. I don't know how to put it, but something concrete that reminded us of the beauty and value in this of the city, and that would be a relief for me, but also for Times readers. So I started to basically do virtual walks around New York, and I wanted to cover different parts of the city. And I started going on with architects, and then I started going with writers, and some wonderful people agreed to do walks with me. And I was, thrilled by the reaction. It was therapeutic for me. It was, I think, therapeutic for other people too. And it was a reminder of, the richness and depth of the city, which is not going anywhere, which remains a kind of bedrock for us as a society. And will, it was something to which I assume we would return once we could go outside again. And even now is, something I think that provides some solace. But the other thing you mentioned is a project which actually I started thinking about right around the time Trump was elected, and I won't go on too long about it. But it's something called Headway, and essentially I'm starting a nonprofit. I have started, and I'm beginning to hire now. It's a nonprofit, and it's an entirely new venture for the Times, nonprofit journalism. Focused on global challenges with an eye toward progress. One of the other things I thought was crucial, and maybe I came to realize was somewhere embedded in my own work already, but needed to be emphasized and done at a scale that I myself couldn't do. What was to get out of the cycle of despair and bad news, and the feeling that we were consumed by 24-hour news and the election cycle and all this stuff. And what we really wanted to have, what we needed to have, were constructive conversations around difficult issues. That is, conversations that didn't promise solutions, but were looking through the lens of what might be done, and that had as a very explicit purpose the idea of provoking a conversation, to move a conversation forward. Hence the name Headway. So we're just starting now, and I've been thrilled by the people who've put up their hand to come work for us. I need to work with people who are a lot smarter and more capable than I am to do a startup. It's all new, but we'll see. And there are many aspects to it, but one of them is that it exists outside the paywall of the New York Times, which is crucial. So we'll live on that platform, and we'll operate in different media, but all of it will be open to everybody, accessible to everybody, and hopefully it'll become a place where people can meet and have conversations that that gets them out of their silos. That's I think one of the benefits of working at the Times, that it's a kind of common ground for a lot of people in different fields. It's a very expensive thing to subscribe to, but it is a place where people of different interests meet. And if we can broaden that, if I can use that platform and make it free around the conversations we hope to have at Headway, hopefully more people can come together who may not otherwise have a place to meet.
That sounds great. So, and the convening power of the Times, of course, is enormous. So I think you'll be able to galvanize the kinds of engagement that you're describing. We have at Taubman College, we have 2 student publications that come out on an annual periodicity, so definitely not the 24-hour news cycle. Right. One on the architecture side is called Dimensions, and the other on the urban planning side is called Agora. And we're going to bring in two of the editors of these collaboratively edited student publications. I'm going to welcome to the stream Rachel Scoff, who is a Bachelor of Science in Architecture student and one of the editors of Dimensions, and Michelle Lincoln, who is a graduate student in the Master of Urban and Regional Planning degree, but also doing a dual degree program with a Master of Science in Environmental Science. And Michelle is one of the editors of Agora. So Rachel and Michelle, welcome and take it away.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And thank you so much, Michael, for that wonderful conversation. On behalf of the Dimension staff, thank you for taking these comments and the conversation that follows. My first question is, your tenure as an architecture critic at the New York Times has seen coverage shift from the work of individual architects to broader questions of policy, infrastructure, and environment. In this way, your definition of architecture is much more expansive than what many consider the definition of architecture is. Why do you think it's important for you to widen the lens of architectural criticism in your writing? And could you speak to the breadth of your coverage in the context of public advocacy?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously this has come up before. And, you know, when I started in this job, one of the reasons I started this job was because I felt that there was a hunger for a conversation that was broader than the conversation just about buildings as objects. And which is, you know, a crude way of describing the architectural conversation at that point. But I think you're right that there was much more focus on the formal and material inventiveness of new buildings, and particularly by you know, a prominent group of architects. I think that's a central part of the of architecture criticism and the conversation around architecture. But I also felt that it was it foreclosed a lot of what architecture is about, not just to me, but I think to architects, which is, you know, that buildings and the things that we design and create are, you know, they're not sculptures in a museum. They're occupied by people. They're inseparable from the politics and economy and all the other aspects of the society that produces them, and that, you know, really to, in a sense, recognize the full meaning and value of architecture and its and design. The conversation had to extend beyond where I think a lot of it was.
I think.
I'm sorry, I was just going to say, the funny thing was, I used to write about art, and I think there were people who, when I took over this job, thought, oh my God, you know, an art critic is just going to be more of that. It's just going to, every building is just going to be like another sculpture. So I think when I didn't do that, it was both surprising to people, and then I think there were other people who said, well, what the hell? I mean, so it's not that I don't actually, you know, have an interest in or an appreciation for the, you know, the beauty and extraordinary creative importance of architecture. I just think, you know, the time was right. And also, may I just say, I think, I'm talking to the two of you, you know, there's a generational shift taking place. I think younger people really wanted to change the conversation and not just have it be about a few guys and Zaha, who were designing really expensive buildings in you know, Dubai.
Yes, I think that's a great comment. As an architecture student, I find that it's so exciting to be able to always think about design not in a kind of empty white box, but to also think, as in our architectural education, more expansively, and to really start focusing on public spaces and how the built environment really affects the way that we, like, the lives that we are living in.
Yeah.
But with that, I'm sure Michelle has a question.
Thank you, Rachel. And I would just like to echo Rachel's sentiments from Agora in saying thank you for answering our questions and allowing us to jump in here and discuss things with you. So you definitely talked a good amount about coronavirus, and the coronavirus has forced us all to change how we interact with our public spaces, buildings, and cities. And I think it's especially important because it's created value in some areas and devalue in others because of the conditions of the virus and its spread. These interactions include, but aren't limited to, closing off downtown streets, like you mentioned, allowing businesses to extend their services past their doors. What do you believe are some of the most significant transformations of the public realm? And what are the implications past the pandemic?
Well, that's a really great question. Earlier I think I was, trying to point to a few of them, which is that we, we need to reimagine our streets and public spaces, and we need to do that because, not just because of Corona, but because many people don't have enough access to open space, especially in many underserved communities in cities, and New York is an example of that. Because environmentally, it's important not to give over so much space to cars, and for public health and mental health, it's important to be able to walk. And there's a whole discussion now in Paris about the 15-minute city, creating communities where more or less everything is within a 15-minute walk from your home, so that people are not having to waste enormous time getting from one place to another, and certainly not by car. Think about it, even for childcare. If you're spending a lot of time trying to get from your home to your work and back and so forth. So these conversations, again, we talked a little earlier about the ripple effects of how everything is connected. I think Corona is pointing out to us the potential, to really reimagine public spaces, and to take a big bite out of the out of this apple, so we really get stuff done. I think it was Obama who had that phrase, never let crisis go to waste, meaning that every crisis is also an opportunity, and I think Corona is one. I don't think people, once bike lanes started being installed in New York City, there were a lot of complaints about them by people, especially car owners above all, and not just in New York, in Los Angeles and San Francisco and a lot of other places. But the attitude of the then transportation commissioner in New York was, well, let's put them in, say they're temporary, and then people will like them and they won't want to get rid of them. And that's exactly what's happened. So I think, COVID has given a taste now to people of what is possible and how streets and sidewalks can be reimagined. And I don't think people are going to say, let's just go back and give over all this space, to cars, to private cars. Talk about inequitable.
Thank you so much. I definitely like the idea of exploring potential, especially in a scenario where a lot of our built environment feels so permanent, if not is permanent. But this idea of reimagining the space that is there and having it be possible, I think opens up professionals, public officials, and the public in general to so many different ways to solve a lot of the inequities and maybe the things that have been kind of disconnected or disassociated from how we live our daily lives. Thank you.
I totally agree, Michelle. And the other thing that it points out is that cities are organisms. They evolve, they change. They were not always this way. Because we see things made out of asphalt and stone and concrete, we can imagine that they were always this way. But New York has evolved enormously. It used to be illegal to park your car on the street overnight. This is not what what streets look like. This is what that means is we can continue to change our environment. It is a reflection of who we are and what we value, and we should not take it for granted. We don't have to have highways rammed through the center of town. We learned that the hard way in the 1960s and 70s, and we can change things now. We should. So COVID teaches us that too.
Excellent points. Thank you.
Thank you. What else do we want to talk about?
I'll ask a question that's a pretty good segue. Here at Taubman College, and specifically in the senior Raoul Wallenberg studio, big studio, students are addressing issues of social inequality and engaging with architectural education as a form of advocacy. What do you think the role of architectural education and the architectural imagination can be in terms of advancing social justice? Are there relationships to be drawn between writing about built architecture and spaces and working on speculative architectural projects?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in that really interesting question. I would say, and I've been thinking about this in terms of headway as well. I think architects, designers, understand as part of the educational process that that when we think through problems, we need to think in a very holistic way. We need to think collaboratively. We need to have different perspectives. We need to understand that solutions are not something that should be just imposed and often can't just be imposed, but need to be arrived at through a kind of process of discussion, compromise, and so forth. So I think central to the architectural education is this way of thinking that also I think makes architects and designers really suited to engaging in other sorts of conversations about society building, not just about how to build a building or design a park or whatever. So I think there's something about the educational process in this particular field which is different than, let's say, going to law school or that comparison is interesting too, right? Because essentially law school, you're taught to know what has happened, what the law is, so you base what you do on precedent. But architecture and design is about what is possible. So it is by its nature speculative and forward-looking. It builds on what has happened before, but it looks ahead. So I think there really is no better field to be engaged with the public realm and the issues of the day than architecture, design, planning. It seems to be the job itself.
I totally agree. And I think what's unique about the architectural education as well is the tools that we are given to use to express some of these ideas, right? We talk about drawing a lot, and we draw a lot, and how the act of drawing itself and the process of drawing is also kind of a form of social advocacy, that we're able to imagine infinite possibilities of possible futures.
Right. And that's what you mean about thinking speculative architecture. I mean, I think, this conversation, not just about, what is, but what could be. This is crucial. And it is people like you guys, going through the system now and then coming out into society who have the ability really to reboot the conversation around the built world. This is the moment, I think.
Yes. And I think just quickly, that's why I think it's so important that we have this Wallenberg studio to contest with in our senior year. The fact that we are directly engaging with some of these really, really complex ideas, not to think about architecture as just a building, but its consequences in the built environment as well.
I'm with you. Yeah.
Just to connect what was and what is and what will be, New York City has a rich history of successful and some not so successful ventures into affordable housing. Now it seems like the margin for investment into equitable and holistic public housing is shrinking, even as innovation in design, quality, and multifunctional public housing is taking off. What is the future for affordable housing and public housing in American cities? As urban planners, what do you think our effort should be to expand access to quality, affordable housing?
Look, there's no more important subject, and no more, daunting challenge, right? I was looking at the statistics about homelessness, and I noticed that in the Bay Area, for instance, 40% of the homeless population are now first-time homeless over the age of 50. So what that means is we're not really necessarily talking about mental health or addiction issues. You're talking about people who have been living on the margins, and now the cost of housing has become prohibitive. Maybe, they just couldn't make that last rent check or whatever. So that's a massive crisis. That number, by the way, used to be 14% nationally. So 14 to 40. And it's not obviously, just homeless. You have, you have an affordability crisis which affects people who consider themselves middle class, certainly working class, and people, cities and societies do not function literally at all unless you have a diverse economic range of people who have the ability to live in the same communities. So, San Francisco, if San Francisco becomes unaffordable to anybody but a tech billionaire, as soon as there's a fire or some crisis, or someone needs a nurse or whatever, or a school teacher, there's not. I mean, it's not how society can function. So obviously, housing is a massive problem, and it's a problem so complicated we can't talk about it all tonight. But let me just say a couple of things about it. First of all, the United States, the federal government used to build public housing and got out of that business with the Nixon administration, and now essentially public housing is something we eke out of private development by providing tax incentives to private developers, often for-profit private developers. Sometimes this works, but what happened to the notion of the right to housing? Why is that not a very basic right? And we know the links between the neighborhoods people grow up in and the outcomes for those people, health and educational outcomes. But the last thing I'll say about this is not only do we need to rethink housing, but we need to remember that, and I'm sorry, but I don't mean to be preaching here, but I mentioned earlier this link between NIMBYs and tenant activists, and you see in some places, I mentioned California, the ways in which rezoning and efforts to create more housing is blocked in many places, like the South Bay, Silicon Valley. And that's tragic, and we have to find ways around that. But the other thing I was going to say is, housing is not something we can separate out, however, from these other issues we've been talking about, like access to transit, jobs, and so forth. The things that make great communities, towns, and cities. We have built housing that is separated. New York built a lot of public housing in the 60s and 70s that was really intended to push poor, above all African American families and tenants to the farthest reaches of the city. We cannot see housing as separate we need to integrate affordable housing, subsidized housing, with communities all across our cities, and to remember that people need more than just a house to have a community. And so that has to go with, thinking about how we create public spaces and parks, how we provide access to schools, libraries, which have become so important, and also retail, not just box stores, but community, local stores, so that every community supports a vibrant and sustainable commercial infrastructure. Easy to say, hard to do.
Thank you. I definitely agree. Housing affects us all, whether we have it or there is a lack of it. And it's definitely always on my mind. And I hope to bring that viewpoint and perspective to my professional work, and always keeping it in mind and critically thinking about housing and how it fits into what I'm doing, considering people need shelter in order to thrive in all the possible ways that
That's
they can.
good.
I think I have one last question. It kind of takes a different direction. In this current age where we are interfacing virtually, we're also seeing printed media shift into a lot more of different interactive forms, such as videos or slideshows. And that gets mirrored in even your articles, where many of them have been accompanied now by videos, GIFs, and interactive 3D visualizations. How do you understand the relationship between text and image in your work, and even more interactive forms? And what future opportunities do you see for further exploring digital media?
So one of the things that I have seen as central to my job, and one of the things I'm really proud of, is to work with colleagues, unbelievably gifted, amazing colleagues at the Times, who work in digital media and graphics, because I realized early on that in order to represent buildings and spaces, it was one thing to write, but even photographs, the two-dimensional images are limited, and they tended, I think, they tended to promote that idea of buildings as things that appeared on the cover of glossy magazines. But in fact, buildings are something we walk through and walk around, and so it was my goal early on to try to enlist my colleagues and try to figure out how to represent what I was writing about in moving through space and in different ways. So that started really most ambitiously with a review I did of the new Whitney Museum in Manhattan, and then more recently with things like writing about a development called Hudson Yards in New York. I think my field has changed so much, and for me, all to the good, because we have these incredible tools now, interactive, but also just amazing visual ways of telling stories, translating data. It's part of what inspired me to want to do Headway, which I think, there are a lot of ways to talk about big global challenges. Podcasts, docs, photo essays, data dumps, a million other things. And I think if we want to have a robust conversation that really brings in a lot of people and that represents the things we're talking about with the complexity that they deserve, then we need to, make use of the full range of technological, tools available to us. I feel this is a golden age for that. Social media is a part of it, but within the confines of the Times, I'm finding plenty of toys to play with, and I'm grateful that the toy owners allow me to play.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Michelle and Rachel, for shaping the conversation and sharing some of what's on your minds and on those of your colleagues. So we'll bring in a couple of folks in the comments have been saying amen to a few of the points that have come up, and they've also been raising additional questions, and maybe we can take one of them from Sven Korsch, a PhD student in our architecture program. He asks about the economic impact on architects and planners as workers and government cutbacks on some of the projects that our fields contribute. What are you seeing, and are you seeing some responses that might help elevate people who shape the built environment?
Yeah, it's a huge worry, and I'm not surprised there are students who are concerned about this. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of a lot of projects. The good thing about a lot of the projects you guys work on is that they're the time scale is long, and many of them, of course, I'm talking now to some extent about commercial projects, but not only. There's a built-in notion that though the economy might not be okay at the moment, we begin the project now in anticipation that things might change. But yes, I think it's very worrisome. The potential upside, of course, is that we may now have an administration that thinks that infrastructure isn't something that should only happen for a week and then never does actually happen. And so there's an incredible need, and possibly there will be an understanding that we are at a moment when when the job creation and the potential to reimagine our infrastructure and public realm, that this is a long overdue and essential part of the nation's response to the pandemic. As I said earlier, I stayed out of the crystal ball business because I really don't know. So I'm saying I understand all the reasons why why people are concerned. But I also think, there's potential hope out there, and we really need to make an argument for a kind of New Deal, not just a Green New Deal. And I'll just remind you, by the way, one of the walks I did was about Rockefeller Center with a wonderful guy named Dan Okrent, who wrote the book on Rockefeller Center. And I was reminded that Rockefeller Center started in basically when the Depression did. It was right into the teeth of the Depression was this project, which ended up taking years, but was a huge job provider, actually the largest job provider in the city, private development in the city, until the Second World War. So we're talking about from 1930 until 1945. And, we can remember that the New Deal was in fact an era of great reimagining and incredible architecture, and jump-started the economy. So that's I think the best hope.
Linked to another dimension of that dynamic, I wonder what you're seeing from your fairly synoptic perch at the Times of, I feel like I discern two changes in, let's say, the construction of the labor market for architects and to some extent for planners. One of them is the rise of data capitalism and the tech sector and the emergence of firms that operate on a kind of tech business model to shape the city, whether that's Sidewalk Labs or the mobility companies, Uber and Lyft and Airbnb and many others now, right? That are shaping buildings and cities, not necessarily through the professional profile of an architect or a planner, but overlapping with our traditional domain. And on the other hand, we have folks in the architecture lobby here at Taubman College and elsewhere who see the vision of a Green New Deal and economic stimulus as linked to unionization and collective forming of collectives and kind of organizing their labor in a distinctive set of ways. How much of that are you seeing in your coverage and in the people you talk to?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an appetite, especially among younger architects and the younger generation, to unionize and to demand fair wages, and the profession, especially for young architects, has long operated in a very inequitable way. It runs up, of course, against an economy that has essentially treated architects like servants. You're hired to do a particular task, you're paid a particular fee, you're protected from certain liabilities as a consequence. On the other hand, you have really no say in the creation of those projects. So I've also seen bunches of younger architects who are interested in trying to become developers too, to actually control their own means of production. And I think all that's great. And I think complicated. It runs up. I mean, I take your point, but I also think places like Sidewalk Labs, Uber and Lyft, that kind of thing. They're very they're selling us an idea of they're selling us what social media sells us, right? Which is the notion of access and convenience and data in order to take away, to some extent, our agency and even our control over our own environment. And I think that there's going to be a reckoning for that. I was glad to see that Toronto, did not just hand over a massively important plot of land to Alphabet, to Sidewalk Labs and Alphabet. But I think that we're going to be playing out that scenario for years and years to come, around all sorts of things too. The conversation around, for instance, driverless cars, which I was very interested in for a while because I thought it was an opportunity to rethink streets and to get rid of a lot of cars and to open space up. But I've increasingly come to wonder not just whether it's actually possible, but whether it isn't a kind of stealthy way of stealing both more information and more space, and leaving us with yet more private vehicles. So yeah. I'm sorry, I drifted off in that conversation. It was a hard question to answer, but
yeah,
I think the gist of the answer is there's a healthy, belated, and necessary movement now to think about fair wages and the role that architects play in controlling their work, and that's going to be a struggle, but it's where architects and planners should be.
Another topic that I see both planners and architects working on is, of course, climate change and decarbonization. And I think some of our colleagues at the college are approaching it from a planning perspective, and certainly there's one of the cases for the future of dense transit served cities like New York or Hong Kong or other places is limiting our carbon output. The pandemic has also triggered us to think a lot about supply chains that have, global supply chains that have been disrupted, and local supply chains and networks that have been elevated, and that the supply chain of our buildings and cities is where a lot of carbon is generated and where future carbon patterns are locked into place. What are there some agendas that you think planners and architects might want to pay attention to for advocating the ways for pursuing positive impacts on climate change in our work?
Yeah, well, I mean, there could be no more urgent subject than that. Or actually, I was listening to some climate experts the other day. One of them said, urgent is the wrong word. The very problem with climate change is that it isn't urgent in the way other things are, like your need to pay the rent or your fear of COVID at the moment, and that has been a huge problem for the discussion around climate, and I think that is true. There's nothing more important, but it's hard to remind people of its urgency because there's always other stuff. And I saw this working on a large project I did a couple of years ago on climate and cities. There are so many different ways we need to be thinking about this, and I think doing a LEED Platinum building is not the least of it, but it became a kind of it became a way of saying that what we were doing was climate conscious when it should be only one small piece of a larger way of thinking. You're talking about the supply chain and materials, and of course that's also another part of it. I can't really imagine going into this field without having this be a top of mind issue, because I can't think of an aspect of what an architect or planner does that should not focus around the issue of resilience and climate. I don't know how you think your way through really any problem. Even the renovation of an apartment in a building, without having to think about issues and begin to make arguments to clients and others about the longer term cost effective ways in which smart climate conscious design is going to benefit those clients, and I think that's part of the task too, right? To not just be doing something because it checks a box, but to be forming an argument that allows people to understand why doing this is more than morally right. It's economically, socially, and in every other way, right, necessary. It's hard to be specific. We could talk about individual projects and things, but I think, I think it's also a subject that requires that we get involved on a political level, because no real large-scale climate issues can happen, can be addressed without engagement on a national and even international level. It's far beyond what any individual architects or designers can do.
Yeah, we have folks working on it from the point of view of building materials and methods like low carbon sequestering concrete, right, or ways of using less concrete in order to reduce the climate impacts. We have people timber, exactly. We have other people working on land use policy and how can we reduce the trip count that people need to lead fulfilling lives so that they aren't activating even very efficient transit methods in order to go about their daily lives.
Right. Well, this is part of that 15-minute city I was talking about. It's part of understanding that we need to rethink the way we have designed our cities and our environment. This country is so car-based, so that almost everything requires, some massive carbon footprint. But even cities, I mean, New York's subway system, which is, one of the crown jewels of American infrastructure, nonetheless was designed around a kind of hub and spoke in which every train would go into Manhattan, and because that's where all the jobs supposedly were, Well, first of all, the city is no longer really functioning that way. Like many other cities, it's become increasingly multinodal, and people need to be able to, access everything, including their jobs, nearby. So we need to rethink infrastructure. A tiny example I'll give you. I'm sorry, going off on this tangent, but I spent a lot of time looking around the suburbs of Paris, many of which are poor, and you have the same sort of system, so that people who may live in one of these suburbs, in order to access a job in another suburb, have to go into Paris and then back out again. So their commute is going to take a lot of time. There's not just, I've gotten a little off carbon, but it does have to do with the fact that it is easier for them, if they can afford it, then to buy a car and drive 20 minutes than it is to spend an hour and a half going into Paris and out. Okay, that's a massive, infrastructural challenge. Paris, by the way, is addressing it. But it requires we think in this larger integrated way about climate and its relationship to all of these other issues like infrastructure, housing, access to jobs, and so forth.
I look forward to learning more about that from Headway once you get your new platform up and running. Michael, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's been a great pleasure.
It really has been an honor, and it's been a lot of fun for me. Thank you again for asking.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye-bye.